For 30 years, George Peterson had delivered mail to the same neighborhood, bringing news both joyful and heartbreaking to doorsteps across suburban Chicago. But his final delivery would be the hardest truth he'd ever carried, a truth that would force Ellen and everyone watching to question whether some lies are more compassionate than honesty. It was a golden Thursday morning at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, and the Ellen DeGeneres show was radiating its signature warmth. Ellen appeared on stage wearing a light blue blazer that caught the studio lights perfectly, her smile genuine and bright as she addressed the enthusiastic audience of 300. "Good morning, everyone," Ellen called out, her arms spread wide as the crowd responded with thunderous applause. "Today we're honoring the everyday heroes who keep our communities connected, the people who show up rain or shine, who know our neighborhoods better than anyone, who've become part of the fabric of our daily lives." The audience settled into appreciative attention as Ellen moved to center stage, her expression becoming more reverent as she prepared to introduce someone special. "The man you're about to meet has been walking the same postal route for 30 years, Ellen continued, pulling out a blue index card. "He's delivered birthday cards, love letters, bills, and bad news. He's watched children grow up, seen families move in and out, and become a trusted face that neighbors look forward to seeing every single day." The studio erupted in warm applause. Stories of long-serving community members always resonated with Ellen's audience, many of whom had their own relationships with postal workers and other service professionals who had become part of their extended families. "What makes this man special isn't just his dedication," Ellen added, waiting for the applause to die down, "but his genuine care for the people on his route. He knows their names, their stories, their joys and sorrows, and after 30 years of faithful service, he's retiring next week. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome George Peterson from Chicago." The spotlight found George immediately, sitting in the fourth row. He was 62 years old with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades walking in all kinds of weather. He wore his best navy blue suit, clearly purchased specially for this occasion, and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who took pride in work that others might consider mundane. What struck everyone who saw George was his genuine humility. There was something remarkably unpretentious about his presence, as if he truly couldn't understand why anyone would consider his work worth celebrating on national television. As George made his way to the stage, Ellen watched him carefully. She'd interviewed many long-serving community workers over the years, and they usually displayed either pride in their service or modest embarrassment at the attention. George showed something different. There was a gentleness to his movements, a carefulness that suggested he was used to handling precious things. "George Peterson," Ellen said warmly as he reached the stage, extending her hand in greeting. 30 years! That's incredible. Thank you so much for your service to your community." "Thank you, Ellen," George replied, his voice deep and steady with a slight Midwestern accent that spoke of his Chicago roots. "I have to say, I never expected to be on television for just doing my job." "Just doing your job?" Ellen laughed. "George, you've been the connection between thousands of people and the outside world for 3 decades. That's not just a job, that's a calling." George settled into the comfortable chair arranged for their conversation, adjusting his tie slightly. Despite his outward composure, Ellen noticed his hands were clasped tightly in his lap, suggesting underlying nervousness about being in the spotlight. "I suppose when you put it that way, it does sound more important than it feels day to day," George admitted. "Tell everyone about your route," Ellen said. "What's it like to walk the same neighborhoods for 30 years?" "It's been a privilege, honestly," George replied, his voice warming as he spoke about something he clearly loved. "When I started in 1994, there were families with newborn babies. I've watched those babies grow up, graduate high school, go to college, get married, have babies of their own. I've delivered their college acceptance letters, their wedding invitations, birth announcements for their children." Ellen was touched by the obvious affection in George's voice. "You must have some incredible memories." "Oh, I do. Thousands of them. Mrs. Chen on Maple Street, she always made sure to have coffee ready for me during the winter months. The Rodriguez family on Oak Avenue threw a party when I delivered their citizenship papers. Little Tommy Williams on Pine Street used to wait by the mailbox every day after school just to say hello." "It sounds like you became part of these families' lives." "In a way, I suppose I did. When you see the same people for 30 years, when you're bringing them their most important news, you become invested in their stories. You celebrate their victories and share their sorrows." Ellen could see the genuine warmth and connection George felt with his community. "I imagine you've also had to deliver some difficult news over the years." George's expression became more somber. That's part of the job too. Foreclosure notices, divorce papers, letters from the military during wartime. You learn to recognize the envelopes that carry heartbreak, and you learn to be gentle when you hand them over. That must be emotionally challenging. It is. But it's also an honor, in a strange way. When someone gets devastating news, sometimes the mailman is the first person they see, the first human contact they have with their new reality. I've always tried to be kind, to be present for whatever they might need in that moment. Ellen was impressed by George's understanding of the emotional weight his job carried. After 30 years, what's been your most memorable experience? George was quiet for a moment, and Ellen could see him choosing his words carefully. There was something in his expression that suggested they were approaching something significant. There's one house on my route, George said slowly, 1247 Willow Street. Mrs. Evelyn Miller lives there. She's 85 years old, been widowed for about 15 years. Every day for the past 10 years, she's waited by her front window for me to arrive. She must really look forward to seeing you. She does, but not for the reason you might think. George paused, clearly wrestling with something. She's waiting for a letter from her son Michael. Ellen sensed they were approaching the heart of George's story. Does her son write to her often? George's expression became pained, and Ellen could see him making a decision about how much to reveal. Ellen, this is where the story gets complicated. Complicated how? George took a deep breath, clearly preparing to share something he'd been carrying alone. Mrs. Miller's son Michael died 10 years ago. Car accident. But she doesn't accept it. She's convinced he's just traveling for work, that he's going to write to her soon, that he's coming home. The studio grew quieter as the audience began to understand they were hearing something much deeper than a typical retirement story. George, Ellen said gently, does Mrs. Miller have dementia? That's what I thought at first, George replied, but her doctor says no, she's mentally sharp in every other way. She remembers everything else perfectly. It's just this one thing, she can't accept that Michael is gone. Ellen felt her heart breaking for this elderly woman who was living in denial about her son's death. That must be so difficult for you to witness. It was, George said, and Ellen caught the past tense. For the first few months after the accident, I'd have to tell her every day that there was no letter from Michael. Every single day I'd watch her face fall, watch her hope die a little bit more. And then the next day she'd be back at the window, waiting. That sounds heartbreaking. It was destroying her, George said, his voice growing thick with emotion. She stopped eating, stopped taking care of herself. She was literally dying of heartbreak, waiting for a letter that would never come. Ellen could see where this story was heading, and she felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. George, what did you do? George looked directly at Ellen, and she could see both shame and defiance in his eyes. I started writing to her. The studio went completely silent. Ellen felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. You started writing to her, Ellen repeated, not sure she'd heard correctly. Every week for the past 10 years, George confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. I write letters from Michael. I tell her about his imaginary job, his imaginary travels, how much he misses her, how proud he is of her. The audience was completely silent, processing the magnitude of what George had just revealed. George, Ellen said carefully, you've been writing fake letters from a dead son to his mother for 10 years? Yes. Ellen was struggling to process the ethical complexity of what George was telling her. And Mrs. Miller believes these letters are real. She does. Every week when I deliver the letter, she lights up. She reads it over and over, carries it with her around the house. She tells her neighbors about what Michael is doing, how well he's doing at his job, when he might be coming to visit. Ellen felt tears building in her eyes as she began to understand the impossible situation George had found himself in. George, why? Why did you start doing this? Because I couldn't watch her die of grief, George said simply. After I started delivering the letters, she began taking care of herself again. She started eating, started gardening, started participating in her community. The letters gave her a reason to live. Ellen was quiet for several moments, absorbing the profound complexity of George's choice.
George, what do the letters say?
George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I brought one of them, in case you wanted to see. Ellen took the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, neat, clearly crafted with love. She read silently for a moment, then looked back at George with amazement. George, this is beautiful. It's full of love and details about her life, asking about her garden, telling her how proud he is of her. I pay attention to what's happening in her life, George explained. When her roses bloom, Michael writes about how he hopes she's enjoying her garden. When she gets her hair done, he tells her how beautiful she must look. When she's been to the doctor, he asks about her health. Ellen was amazed by the care and attention George had put into maintaining this elaborate fiction. How do you know these details about her life? I talked to her neighbors, her doctor, the grocery store clerk. Everyone in the neighborhood knows about the letters, and they help me make sure Michael's responses are appropriate to what's happening in her life. Ellen felt her heart breaking all over again. The whole neighborhood is part of this? They've all seen what the letters do for her. Mrs. Miller went from being a lonely, heartbroken woman waiting to die to being someone who has purpose, hope, connection to life. The letters aren't just keeping her alive, they're keeping her living. Ellen was struggling with the ethical implications of what George was describing. But George, isn't this lying to someone who's vulnerable? George's expression became defensive but not angry, more like someone who had wrestled with this question every day for 10 years. Yes, it's lying. But Ellen, the truth was killing her, literally killing her. The lie is what brought her back to life. Ellen was quiet for a long moment, processing the impossible choice George had made. George, what happens when you retire? Who's going to write the letters? George's face fell. I don't know. That's what's been keeping me up at night. My replacement is a young guy, doesn't know Mrs. Miller's story. I've been trying to figure out how to transition this without destroying her world. Ellen felt the weight of George's dilemma. Have you considered telling her the truth? Every day for 10 years, George replied. But Ellen, she's 85 years old. What would be the point of giving her that pain now? What would be the kindness in taking away the one thing that gives her joy? Ellen was struggling with the complexity of the situation. George, I have to ask, is Mrs. Miller here today? George's eyes widened in panic. Yes, she's in the audience. She thinks she's here because the Postal Service is honoring me. Ellen, please don't. George, Ellen interrupted gently. What if I told you that Mrs. Miller might be stronger than you think? What if she's been waiting for permission to grieve properly? What do you mean? Ellen gestured toward the audience. Mrs. Evelyn Miller, would you please join us on stage? George's face went white. Ellen, no, please, this will destroy her. Trust me, Ellen said softly. Mrs. Evelyn Miller made her way to the stage slowly, using a walker but moving with surprising grace for her age. She was a small woman with silver hair styled in careful waves, wearing a floral dress that was clearly her best outfit. Her eyes were bright and alert, and when she looked at George, there was genuine affection in her expression. Mrs. Miller, Ellen said as she reached the stage, thank you for joining us. You must be so proud of George's 30 years of service. Oh, I am, Mrs. Miller said, her voice clear and strong despite her age. George is more than just our mailman. He's been like family to all of us on Willow Street. Ellen looked at George, who was clearly terrified about what was going to happen next. Mrs. Miller, George has been telling us about your neighborhood, about how well he knows all his customers. He certainly does. George knows everything about everyone. When my roses are blooming, when I've been to the doctor, when I'm expecting important mail. Mrs. Miller's eyes twinkled slightly as she said this last part. Ellen caught the subtle emphasis and felt her heart rate increase. Mrs. Miller, George mentioned that you receive letters from your son Michael. Mrs. Miller looked at George with an expression that was gentle but knowing. Yes, Michael writes to me every week, such thoughtful letters, full of details about my life, asking about things that only someone who cares deeply would think to ask about. George was staring at Mrs. Miller with growing realization and horror. Mrs. Miller, Ellen said carefully, can I ask you something personal? Of course, dear. How long have you known that the letters aren't really from Michael? The studio went completely silent. George's mouth fell open. Mrs. Miller smiled with the patient wisdom of someone who had lived 85 years and understood more about human nature than most people ever would. Oh, I've known from the beginning, she said simply. I know my son's handwriting, I know his voice, and I know he died 10 years ago in that terrible car accident. George stared at her in complete shock. You knew? Of course I knew, dear, Mrs. Miller said, reaching out to pat George's hand. But George, those letters weren't for me, they were for you. Ellen felt tears streaming down her face as she began to understand what had really been happening. I don't understand, George whispered. George, you dear sweet man, Mrs. Miller said gently. You thought you were saving me from grief, but what you were really doing was saving yourself from the pain of watching me grieve. The letters weren't keeping me alive. They were keeping your heart from breaking every day when you saw me waiting for news that would never come. George was crying now, overwhelmed by the realization that his 10-year deception had been known all along. "Mrs. Miller," Ellen said softly, "why did you let him continue writing them?" "Because," Mrs. Miller replied, "George needed to believe he was helping me more than I needed to stop him from trying. That young man has been carrying the weight of my grief for 10 years, thinking he was protecting me from it. How could I take that away from him?" Ellen was amazed by this woman's understanding and compassion. "But weren't you angry about the deception?" "Angry?" Mrs. Miller laughed softly. "I was grateful. Do you know how rare it is to find someone who cares so much about a stranger's pain that they'll take it on themselves? George gave me something more precious than accurate mail delivery. He gave me proof that someone cared enough about my well-being to lie for it." George looked at Mrs. Miller with an expression of wonder and confusion. "But if you knew Michael was dead, why did you keep waiting by the window?" "Because you needed me to," Mrs. Miller said simply. "I could see how much it meant to you to bring me those letters, to see me smile when I received them. My grief was already processed, George. I did my mourning 10 years ago. But your grief for my grief, that was fresh every week." Ellen was struggling to process the profound role reversal that had just been revealed. "Mrs. Miller, you've been protecting George all this time?" "We've been protecting each other," Mrs. Miller corrected. "He protected me from having to disappoint him by not being comforted by his letters. I protected him from having to face the fact that sometimes grief can't be fixed, only witnessed." George was shaking his head in disbelief. "Mrs. Miller, I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping you, but I was really just helping myself feel better." "Oh, George," Mrs. Miller said, moving closer to him. "You were helping me, just not in the way you thought. You were helping me remember what it feels like to be loved. Every week when you brought me those letters, you were showing me that someone cared enough about my happiness to spend time crafting something beautiful for me." Ellen stood up and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've just witnessed is one of the most beautiful examples of mutual care I've ever seen." George thought he was protecting Mrs. Miller from grief. Mrs. Miller was actually protecting George from the helplessness of not being able to fix her grief. The audience rose to their feet in sustained applause, many people crying as they witnessed this extraordinary demonstration of love and understanding. Ellen turned back to George and Mrs. Miller. "What happens now?" Mrs. Miller smiled at George with obvious affection. "Well, I suppose that depends on whether George would like to continue being my friend, rather than my postal worker. Would you like to come visit me for real? Have coffee? Talk about actual things? I could use the company." George stared at her, realizing that his decade of deception was being transformed into an invitation for genuine friendship. "You'd want that?" he asked, "even knowing that I lied to you for 10 years? "George," Mrs. Miller said firmly, "you didn't lie to me. You loved me. There's a difference." Ellen reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "George," Mrs. Miller, "I can't add years to your friendship, but I can make sure you have resources to enjoy the years you have together." Mrs. Miller opened the envelope and gasped. "Ellen, this is far too generous." "It's not generous enough for what you two have taught us today," Ellen replied. "You've shown us that love sometimes looks like deception, that protection sometimes requires participation in someone else's coping mechanism." George looked at Mrs. Miller with tears in his eyes. "I still can't believe you knew all along." "George," she said, taking his hand, "a mother knows when someone is trying to take care of her, and after 85 years I've learned that the kindest thing you can do sometimes is let people take care of you the way they need to." The episode ended with George and Mrs. Miller sitting together, both crying and laughing, finally free to have the honest friendship that had been disguised as postal service for 10 years. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is participate in someone else's method of survival, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone love you the only way they know how.